Dark Side of the Ring this week was the Abdullah the Butcher episode. It is the one that I was looking forward to the least of all the episodes this season. And to that end, it did not disappoint. Abdullah, he was a feared figure by the fans. Absolutely. It's kind of like how Bruiser Brody was when you would see him running into the crowd like a wild man in those matches in Japan, and the fans would scatter. They would run for their lives. If you were one of those fans, especially a younger fan, and you saw this giant man coming at you covered in blood with a fork in his hand, you would probably shit your pants. He made a lot of money, and he was a great gimmick back in his day. I was never really a fan. You know, he never stayed in any one place for too long. He was the traveling attraction. He was big in places like Puerto Rico and Japan. The first half of the episode was background, although they left out a lot of stuff as far as background goes, which is what happens when you have less than 45 minutes to cram everything in. The second half was basically a retelling of the history between Abdullah and Devon Nicholson, better known as Hannibal, the wrestler who allegedly contracted hepatitis C from a match with Abdullah the Butcher. That's what he's always claimed. He claims he got Hep C from him in a double juice match they did back in 2007, and that it later cost him a contract with WWE. There were lawsuits, there were court cases and judgments that Hannibal won against him, and to this day he still has yet to collect a penny. It's like Nancy Argentino's family winning a $500,000 wrongful death suit against Jimmy Snuka for killing their daughter. That was in 1985 that they won that judgment. The family never saw a dime of that money, because he always claimed he was broke. I'm broke, brother. Brother, I got no money, brother. Even though he kept working. Even got a second run in WWE, but I guess Vince McMahon paid him in Monopoly money because he was still too broke to pay. Brother. I also remember Snuka's widow claiming he couldn't read or write in English, and I laughed when I heard Abby claim the same thing in the episode here, that he never learned how to read or write, which is why he lost the lawsuit that Hannibal filed. Because they would send him summonses and other legal documents, but he couldn't read them. So he had no idea that he was supposed to show up for depositions and whatnot. You know, a lot of these episodes with these old school, wrestlers, they're all carnies. You expect a certain level of embellishment and exaggeration. I kind of joked about it when I was covering Tales from the Territories, which I enjoyed, but you take it for what it is. It's a mixture of fact and fiction. There were so many stories about eyeballs being gouged out. After a while, it became comical. So you expect something like that with these shows. It comes with the territory. Having my intelligence insulted is something entirely different, and that's how I felt watching this. There's also a lot of really scummy people in the wrestling business. There are real-life heels, and there are real-life babyfaces. There were no babyfaces in this episode. Only heels. Mick Foley was interviewed for this. I guess he would be a babyface, but Mick Foley was interviewed for this. You'll never get Mick Foley to say a cross word about anybody. And he admits that he idolized Abdullah growing up. He even put a photo of him on his wall in college. He would tell people that Abby was his father. Hugo Savinovich, who was a star in Puerto Rico and a long-time Spanish language announcer for WWE for almost 20 years. He was interviewed as someone who was close to Abdullah for a long time. In fact, he was Abby's manager in Puerto Rico. He had trained to wrestle himself, but the promoter made him a manager instead, and they had some footage of that. They also interviewed his caretaker and his sister Josephine and his brother Ralph. They talked about their poor upbringing with 8 people sharing a 2-bedroom house up in Canada, which is where he's from. Abby dropped out of school in the 2nd grade, worked as a janitor, a mover. He taught karate to senior citizens so they would know how to defend themselves. And as they tell the story, it was his teaching karate that got him noticed by a promoter who suggested that, hey, you should be a wrestler. And he scoffed at the idea and said, I'm not going to do that crap. Until the promoter told him, hey, you can make a lot of money doing this. Then he changed his tune. And from there, the story has him traveling to Detroit to work for the original Sheik, Ed Farhat, who wasn't just a big star in the ring, he ran the territory. But they made it sound like he got into the business and immediately started working for the Sheik as Abdullah the Butcher. He was wrestling at Cobo Hall. There was a huge chunk in the middle that got left out here. They completely glossed over the years and years that he spent working for other promoters under different names. He was not always Abdullah the Butcher. And he was not always working main events at Cobo Hall. Abdullah the Butcher didn't happen on day one. It took time before he created the character. But there was a story, and this was not mentioned in the episode. And honestly, I can understand why. It wasn't anything that really impacted his career, although it could have. Had things in this story happened a little bit differently, it could have very well affected his career. But I just thought this story would have been perfect for one of their reenactments that they do on these shows. Back in the 60s and 70s, there were a number of airplane hijackings in the news. It was like an epidemic of hijackings. There was one newspaper clipping I saw from July of 1968 to February of 1969 alone. Just that period, July of 68 to February of 69, there were 27 hijackings. One of those hijacked airliners was an Eastern Airlines flight that was en route from San Juan to Miami and happened to be carrying Abdullah the Butcher. And the story said the hijacker was a fat man who hid an automatic pistol in a shirt box that was in his lap. The man wanted to go to Cuba to visit his sick father, and he told them he felt like this was his only recourse. This was the only way he could think of to try to get to Cuba. He wasn't threatening to shoot anyone. He wasn't waving the gun around and yelling and screaming. They said he actually seemed kind of nervous. But Abby and another wrestler on the plane happened, again, to be on the flight. They were pissed off about the whole thing and the flight possibly being diverted to Havana. So Abby got up out of his seat and he started moving towards the hijacker. Thankfully, one of the flight attendants convinced him to go back to his seat because who knows how that would have turned out otherwise. I mean, it wasn't some skilled assassin. It was just some random guy who thought this was the only way he could get to Cuba to see his father. But he still had a gun. You know, you put a gun in someone's hand when they're nervous, anything can happen. In the story, it described Abby as 230 pounds with scars on his bald head. That may be the most shocking part, that Abby was ever 230 pounds. See, in my head, I kind of envisioned when he popped out of his mother's womb, he was already, pretty much a cool 250. I'm trying to picture 230-pound Abdullah the Butcher in my head. I just can't do it. I can't do it. I gotta find photos of him from the 60s just to see it for myself. But they talked about his time in Puerto Rico, the home of hardcore, and no one shed more blood in their matches than Abdullah the Butcher. Whether it was his own blood or other people's blood, nobody shed more blood than he did. He was big in Japan also, not only in the ring. They showed him appearing in movies and TV commercials. He was in cartoon form. He was in video games. He was like a pop culture celebrity over there. He even recorded an album. And then we meet Hannibal, Devon Nicholson, who started wrestling for Stampede back in 2001. He even started his own promotion up north, which I believe he still runs to this day. But he started that up, all that before finally he works with Abdullah. Abby is the first wrestler to really take him under his wing and teach him the business. They would tag together. They would work against each other. He says he knows people are going to hate him for exposing Abby, but he doesn't care. Actually, they open the episode, the end of the intro to the episode, is just Hannibal on camera staring directly at us to deliver the following message to Abdullah the Butcher. You're a piece of shit, and I hope that when you die a really slow and painful death. What a heartwarming message. Tony Atlas was also interviewed for this. He talked about Abby taping blades to each one of his fingers and cutting people with them during his matches. The idea of him doing that to people, if they weren't expecting it, or if they had not agreed to it beforehand, and maybe some of them did, but if not, that's just sickening. Tony said that nobody ever complained about it that he was aware of, because if you did, then you wouldn't be considered tough enough. What a business. Back to Hannibal. He said he was signed to a WWE contract. And they did show footage of some of the C-level shows that he worked for them, although the footage looked to be from 2005. So that was not when he was signed. But he did get signed later on. It wasn't until years later that he got signed to a contract. And then, again, he claims, when they found out that he had hepatitis C, they rescinded his deal. And he's talked elsewhere about them pulling the deal not for medical reasons, but because there were a handful of states that wouldn't license him to wrestle because of the hep C, or they wouldn't allow him to work there. And I don't know what states those would have been. Obviously, if it was New York or California or Florida, that would have been a problem. If it was North Dakota or Utah or something, that's less of an issue because they don't run shows there. Now, there are international tours. People like Jeff Hardy and MVP couldn't work in the past because of their criminal records. Or the Usos, sometimes couldn't get across the border because of their DUIs. Hannibal was not a star on their level. But if he was ever going to be, and he would not have been, he doesn't have the best reputation to begin with. But hypothetically, if he was ever going to be a star on that level, then it would be a problem if he wasn't allowed to work in certain places. So he was confused about how he contracted the disease in the first place. Tony Atlas said a lot of guys would use dirty blades. They would share a blade with somebody who needed one for their match. You could be in the locker room, and if you wanted to get color or you were told you're getting color that night, you might turn to someone like Abdullah, who you know is going to be prepared and say, hey, Abby, I need a blade for tonight, right? That's the sort of thing that, according to Tony Atlas, would go on and would happen. And then now look, sharing is caring, but the problem is that after the match would be over, that person, let's say Abby, would take it back from them after. They would take back the dirty blade. They might not even clean it. So now you have this person who just cut themselves with a razor blade, and they're giving it back to the person they got it from, who in turn will end up cutting themselves or someone else with that same dirty blade. It's like drug addicts that share needles. It's sick. Nicholson immediately thinks it may have been from Abdullah, who said in the episode he didn't want to talk about any of that stuff. Nicholson had a documentary that was being made at the time about his journey to WWE that went from, this happy thing to being a sad thing when he found out he wasn't going to WWE. And I think it may have been his videographer who found the footage of the match that he had with Abdullah from 2007. Whoever it was who found the footage. Nicholson claims that this is the match from a Bad News Allen tribute show. Was May of 2007, where he contracted the disease. It was Hannibal against Abdullah the Butcher in a steel cage match. And they showed the footage. Abdullah, he cuts his own head with a razor, and then he uses the same razor blade taped to his finger to poke at Hannibal's forehead. You can see it plain as day. He pokes him over and over and over again. Now, I should note that before that match, Nicholson was coming off of a tour of Puerto Rico, where I'm sure he was blading himself probably in every match. His opponents may have been doing the same thing. Then he comes back and he works with Abby. But he goes and finds a lawyer. He sues Abby over it. They got Abby to provide a blood sample which showed a history of hepatitis. Not only did he have it, he had the exact same strain that Nicholson had. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I'm going to play devil's advocate. I do wonder, given how many other matches he was bleeding in, how sure can he be that it was actually Abdullah that gave him the hepatitis and not the other way around? Right? I mean, there may be a way for them to know. I just wonder how they can be so sure. I don't doubt that Abdullah probably had hepatitis for years from all the bloodbaths that he had. And he wasn't exactly willing to provide a blood sample. He had to be forced to do so. So if he knew, or if he thought that he might have the disease, or even if he didn't know, but he never bothered to get himself tested and checked for his own health, more importantly for the health of the people he was working with and cutting, that makes him a gigantic piece of shit. This is where we hear Abby talking about how he can't read or write, so he couldn't read the lawsuit when he was served the papers in the mail. And so Nicholson won a default judgment when he didn't respond. He actually won in court twice, once in Ontario and then once in Georgia, which is where Abby used to run his own, was it Ribs and Chinese Food restaurant, I think? He won $2.3 million in damages. He still has not seen a dime. He's accused Abby of hiding his assets. Tony Atlas says that Devon Nicholson shouldn't get anything, and he blames him for not cutting himself. He claims he was too afraid to do it himself, which sounds very odd, considering how much Nicholson bled in all of his other matches. I doubt he was having other people cut him in those matches. He seemed like he was perfectly fine cutting himself. I know he also sued WWE for wrongful termination in 2011. He settled with them the following year. I don't know for how much. I don't know what the terms were. I don't think that was ever disclosed. Abby's caretaker and his brother and sister, they parrot this nonsense about him not being able to read or write. Even Mick Foley, who speaks about the man in glowing terms, said he traveled the road for years with Abby. They would eat out at restaurants sometimes 3 times a day. Never, not one time did he ever see Abby having a problem reading menus. Hugo Savinovich, who also spent all that time with Abby, said this was the first he ever heard that he couldn't read or write. It was a convenient excuse for him to come up with, and I don't believe a word of it. His caretaker showed us some photographs, allegedly, of Abby's home. You see water damage on the walls and such, to show us the poor conditions that he's living in since he has no money to fix any of it. She says people have taken advantage of him over the years. They threw quite the pity party for him in this episode. As far as Nicholson goes, he's no better than Abby. I have no sympathy for the guy, especially after the referee incident in Texas, and I was very happy they covered this and they did not shy away from it. What Nicholson claims Abby did to him, there's no excuse for that. But for Hannibal to play victim when he did what he did to this guy 2 years ago is disgusting. There was a world-class pro wrestling show in Irving, Texas. Nicholson was working the show not as Hannibal, but as his alter ego, this other character he calls the Blood Hunter. By the way, he set up a GoFundMe a few months after this incident to raise money to produce a movie about his Blood Hunter character. He was asking for $50,000. You would be better off setting your money on fire. He raised a little over $200 Canadian before it was shut down. But it was the Blood Hunter against Carlito. And there was a planned spot with a referee, this guy Lando Del Toro, who cut a deal with Nicholson before the match. He was going to dress up like a referee, and he was going to get color after the match for like $75 or something, I think is what the cop said he was paid. He agreed to do the spot. He said, no problem, I bled before. And he did bleed. He bled a lot more than he bargained for. Things got out of control. Nicholson used a spike to stab this guy in the head multiple times. I think he's claimed he didn't realize the spike was sticking out of the bottom of his hand as he was jabbing him repeatedly in the head with it. It was disturbing to watch. And not disturbing in a getting heat kind of way. It was disturbing in a you're taking liberties with someone and mutilating them kind of way. It was sickening to watch. Nicholson claimed he wasn't even given the spike until he was in the ring. So he had never handled it before, and he had trouble seeing out of the eye holes of his mask due to the mesh. If that's the case and you can't see, then why the fuck are you using a spike to cut somebody open? He claimed it was the actual spike that Kevin Sullivan used in the 80s on Dusty Rhodes. Sullivan was the one booking the show that night. Nicholson blamed Del Toro for not letting him know that he was really hurting him during the angle. He blamed the other guy. I guess he was blameless for what happened. It was the referee's fault for not speaking up. It was the mask's fault because he couldn't see. The actual referee for the match itself said after that he knew something was off with Nicholson even before the match when he saw him, I guess in the back, stumbling around. Nobody could find him for almost 10 minutes before he was scheduled to go out. Del Toro ended up with 7 staples in his head. He underwent emergency surgery to repair a severed artery in his skull. He lost almost 3 pints of blood. He ended up back in the hospital later on with a blood infection. Someone set up a GoFundMe to help him pay for his medical bills. The promotion, which I think has since gone belly up, they banned Nicholson from all events going forward. They said they would never book him. They would never do business with him again. He's lucky he wasn't prosecuted for what he did. He should have been blackballed from the wrestling business. And basically he was From the looks of it, he's only wrestled twice since then. Both times were for his own promotion. He booked himself. There should be no place in wrestling for people who do that sort of thing. They aired an audio clip of Lance Storm on Wrestling Observer Radio after the incident happened. He was appalled. He was talking about how appalled he was by the entire thing. He was wondering why charges weren't pressed and why Nicholson wasn't in jail for what he did. Del Toro opted to not press charges at the time, which is too bad, because he should have been thrown in a cell for what he did. In the episode, Nicholson says the promoter didn't have any medics on site, and that it went on longer than it should have, and it was bad communication all around. More excuses. It's everyone else's fault. It's like I said at the top of this, there are no good people in this episode. If I showed this episode to someone who knew nothing about pro wrestling, but they know I'm a big fan and I cover it, God only knows what they would think of me. I would be embarrassed. I'm sure their opinion of me would drop faster than WWE dropped Hannibal. Abby, at the end of this, is asked about his legacy. He says, "I just want respect for all that I've done." He said, "I did not do all the things I'm accused of doing." He said he got shafted, all the tapes, what he made for many, many years. He says, "I got nothing." It's hard to feel sorry for anyone in this episode, because there are no likable people involved here.